As we saw at the end of the previous lecture, everyone in the Paleolithic period was, so to speak, on the other side of history, in that everyone was struggling for survival. In fact, the human race came near to the brink of extinction. It survived the eruption of the supervolcano in Sumatra, as we saw by the skin of its teeth. And no doubt there were other catastrophes as well that all but brought the curtain down on human life. The threat of extinction is etched in our racial memory. Think of the flood story in Genesis, or the one in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In today's lecture, by contrast, we're going to move into a period of history when human life becomes more secure, when humans are able to establish a daily pattern of life that would be recognizable to us today in conditions that are more or less settled. I wouldn't call it a civilization. We'll talk about that word in the next lecture. But it's a whole lot better than what preceded it. And that's the thesis, the message, so to speak, of the present lecture. We're going to be focusing mainly on the region known as Mesopotamia, which is where many of the advances in culture took place. Mesopotamia comprises modern-day Iraq, part of southeast Turkey, northeast Syria. It's a Greek word that means the land between two rivers, the two rivers being the Tigris and the Euphrates. They both have their source in the uplands of Turkey and flow into the Persian Gulf. This lecture is a river story because it was very largely due to the Tigris and the Euphrates that culture evolved in this region. And the reason for this is because they provided the means and the setting for some of the earliest attempts at agriculture and irrigation. Even if you look at a map of the region today, you'll see that there's a green swathe of cultivated land on either side of the two rivers. We're going to be looking at how geography and climate enabled human society to take a huge leap forward. We're also going to examine the specific ways in which the various cultures that evolved had much in common with each other, even though they also had their own distinctive characteristics. Lastly, we're going to see how, as everyday life evolved and became more complex, peoples and cultures began to struggle with one another for supremacy and domination. Some words at the beginning about the passage of time. We live today in a world where the rate at which the world around us is changing is phenomenally fast. It's as if someone has a finger permanently on the fast-forward button. But when we go back to any other period of human history, and particularly if we go back about 12,000 years, it's as if everything is moving at a snail's pace. Last time, we were able to cover hundreds of thousands of years because daily life remained more or less static, at least from our distant vantage point. In this lecture, we're only going to be covering about 8,000 years of human history, from about 10,000 to 2000 BC. And I say only because time is beginning to rev up. In the previous lecture, we covered millions of years of human history. By the time we get to the end of our course, we'll only be able to cover, say, 100 years. Even so, it'll still be like watching paint dry by comparison with the rapid rate of change that we're used to today. I mentioned last time that if you lived near the sea, you might be a voyager forager. Living in Mesopotamia around 10,000 BC, however, you'll probably be a hunter-gatherer. That's to say, you hunt wild animals, you gather berries, nuts, mushrooms, and you fish. You use axes whose heads are made of flint. You move your campsite regularly, following the trail of food. You have domesticated dogs to help you hunt. You probably don't have a cat, however. The very earliest evidence of a domesticated cat comes from Cyprus, where A human grave dated 7,300 BC was found with the bones of a cat. The kitty was perhaps so beloved that its owner had decided that he or she had to take it with her to the afterlife. As resources are scarce in Mesopotamia in 10,000 BC, you have to defend yourself from other hunter-gatherer groups, probably fighting with them to the death for valued hunter-gathering grounds. Turf warfare, in other words, in the literal sense of the word. Then, around 9,500 BC, a dramatic change in the environment takes place. The world begins to emerge from the last ice age, and grasslands begin to spread across much of what we call the Middle East. People begin to clear openings for grass to grow, to attract animals, and to create living spaces in the woods for themselves. We're now at what archaeologists used to call the Neolithic Revolution, the revolution of the new Stone Age, although it's now becoming clear that there was more continuity with the Paleolithic period, the Old Stone Age, than used to be thought. The change in environment is marked by the widespread adoption of sedentism, meaning a sedentary way of life, though not in the modern sense of the term. Sedentism means residing in the same place, instead of always following your food source. And among the first people known to have practiced sedentism are the Natufians, who flourished from 12,500 to 9,500 BC. The Natufian homeland was primarily in what we call the Levant, Jordan, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, though there were some Natufian sites in Mesopotamia. Along with sedentism came the introduction of agriculture. And once again, it may be that the Natufians can claim credit for being the first farmers around 11,500 BC. Farming revolutionized human life and was an enormous catalyst for change. People learned how to mark out fields, plant seeds, harvest crops, and make bread. And they also learned how to domesticate first sheep and then a little later cattle and pigs. We certainly shouldn't suppose that the landscape where farming was practiced changed dramatically, that it suddenly took on the modern appearance of a farmed landscape. Farming was on a very small scale and in isolated pockets. There would have been something magical about farming in this period of human history. You would have sensed only very dimly the connection between cause and effect. You certainly didn't see yourself obeying the laws of nature. You wouldn't have had the faintest idea of such a concept. Rather, you see yourself trying to control what was wild and chaotic. The cycle of the seasons is a complete mystery to you. So all the actions that you perform are accompanied by ritual in order to secure the favor of the gods, or more likely that of the spirits which surround you and influence every natural event. Hence, the importance of fertility religion, often symbolized by a heavily pregnant woman like the famous Venus of Willendorf, 4 inches high and some 20 to 25,000 years old. In your mind, all forms of fertility are linked, and no symbol better expresses fertility than that of a heavily pregnant woman. The introduction of agricultural sedentism brought a huge change in the mindset of human beings. Now, for the first time, you would have enjoyed a sense of safety and security in having a few jars of stored grain between yourself and famine. You would have had the leisure to create works of art, make up stories, and perhaps specialize in making pottery or jewelry. Pottery was perhaps invented in Mesopotamia as early as 6,000 BC. And since you now had more possessions than you could carry on your back, and since too you occupied land that you had to sweat over to make it yield you a harvest, you developed a greater sense of territoriality and a sharper need to protect what was yours against the encroachments of others. The earliest permanent settlements in Mesopotamia, which also date to around 6000 BC, were in northern Iraq and Syria. They first developed in the north because there's more plentiful rainfall in the north of this region than there is in the south. So we see, again, the importance of climate. Living close to the riverbank, you built your house either from piled up mud or from layers of mud or with sun-dried mud brick. And then you covered the surface of your walls in plaster. And using again the mud, you created pottery, both to eat and to drink out of and to store things in. And using the two rivers, you traded over long distances. You were particularly keen to acquire obsidian, a stone that was used to shape arrowheads. When you discovered the technique of irrigation, you were able to establish settlements further south. The discovery of irrigation made as profound an impact upon human life as the discovery of the means to make and control fire. Henceforth, you could control floods, though at times they overwhelmed you, as happens all too frequently to this day. The story of the cataclysmic flood that is recorded in both Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh may have its origins in a particularly severe flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates River, resulting in very severe loss of life. I'm now going to zoom forward to 3000 BC, to the Bronze Age period, so named because bronze now began to replace stone as the preferred material for tools and weapons. The peoples living in Mesopotamia by this date share a great deal in common with one another. First, a lot of them live in what we call cities. The earliest city in the region may well be Uruk, modern-day Warka, on the banks of the Euphrates. It was part of the ancient so-called kingdom of Sumeria in southern Iraq, and it flourished from 3500 BC. The kingdom of Sumeria was a loose confederation of city-states, some of which exercised sovereignty over others. Each city had its own king, but no king managed to establish dominion over the whole of Sumeria. We certainly shouldn't be thinking of nations with political boundaries at this state. Uruk probably numbered about 10,000 people, and it wasn't the first city to be founded. That distinction goes to Jericho on the west bank, which was settled as early as 9000 BC. Another earlier city is Catalhuyuk in Turkey, which was founded around 7500 BC. I'd like to pause and talk about Catalhuyuk for a moment. It's a reminder that humans aren't genetically programmed to found cities. Catalhuyuk didn't have streets. All the houses were bunched together, so if you wanted to get to one at the center, you'd have to literally climb over the ones at the periphery. And it's not clear that they had doors either. So imagine some Neolithic genius had to invent streets and doors. And of course, there were no places to gather and no public squares either. Catalhuyuk flourished for about 1,000 years, largely due to its trade in obsidian, that volcanic stone I mentioned earlier. By contrast to Catalhuyuk, Uruk is the first settlement that has unambiguously been identified as a focus for administrative, religious, and civic expression. A city or city-state in the fullest sense of that word. It had surrounding walls made of brick that were 6 miles in circumference. And like other Sumerian city-states, we should probably think of Uruk as an irrigated oasis surrounded by desert. As you strolled through the streets, yes, it did have streets, you would have seen residential areas, canals, palaces, and temples. Looking up, you would have had an impressive view of the main temple, which was established at the highest point of the city. This was a terraced or step pyramid with receding platforms known as a ziggurat. A ziggurat was believed to be the dwelling place of a god, because by this point in time, people believed that the gods could be encouraged and enticed to dwell among them. It was built out of sun-dried bricks, faced by fired bricks. There were thick walls, also made of mud brick, 6 miles in circumference, pierced by gates surrounding the city. It's difficult not to feel in complete awe of these first cities and of the people who built them. They were light years ahead of the caves and the small villages that preceded them, and they represented a bold new experiment in human living. And as I said, the concept of city dwelling that had to be invented. As well as urbanization, another thing the Mesopotamian people shared in common is cuneiform writing, which they used primarily for administrative purposes. The earliest example comes from the temple complex of Eanu at Uruk. And the word cuneiform derives from cuneus, which is Latin for wedge. It's so named because of the wedge shape of the writing signs. Writing seems to have been discovered independently in Central America, China, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, all around the same time. That's to say around 3,300 BC. And how that came about is a mystery. At the moment, scholars think that the Mesopotamians were just ahead, but that view may change. The Egyptians, whom we'll talk about in the next lecture, wrote mainly on papyrus, whereas the Chinese wrote on bamboo, and both of these materials are highly perishable. So it may be that the earliest examples of their writing have simply not survived. The Mesopotamians, on the other hand, wrote on moist clay tablets using a pointed reed stylus. They simply scooped up the clay from the riverbanks in the same way that they scooped up the clay to fashion mud bricks. So those rivers served them well. The tablets were generally left to dry in the sun, though some were deliberately baked. Once they dried, they're pretty well indestructible, and as a result, thousands upon thousands have survived. There are 130,000 such tablets in the British Museum alone. The earliest ones are inscribed with pictographs, that's to say, images or symbols of the objects that they represent. Later, however, the Mesopotamians came to realize that a symbol could also represent the sound of the thing itself. In other words, that a writing system could be phonetic. And eventually, these symbols evolved into abstract signs that were made out of various combinations of cuneiform impressions. And then we have a real writing system. It's impossible to overestimate the importance of writing for the development of the human mind. It enables it to keep track of things, to record historical events, to create imaginary worlds and landscapes, to engage in complex thinking, to undertake higher mathematics, and so much more besides. I'd not be able to deliver a course of 48 lectures if I didn't make copious notes. As I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of cuneiform tablets were used for administrative purposes. In other words, they served the function of what we might call bean counting. But some also served a literary purpose. Mesopotamian peoples from 3000 BC onwards shared a similar belief system, accompanied by a shared mythology and a shared set of rituals. We know about their belief system because their tablets, which were inscribed in a number of languages found all over Mesopotamia, tell us stories about the gods and their interactions with human beings. The most celebrated story is the so-called Epic of Gilgamesh, which I referred to earlier. I love to teach the Epic of Gilgamesh to students just after they've arrived at Colgate, because it's all about growing up. Gilgamesh, who is king of Uruk, the city I mentioned a moment ago, wants to leave a great name behind him, like any aspiring young person. And he does so, but at great cost. The cost is the life of his dearest friend, Enkidu. He also wants to become immortal, but he hasn't the strength to stay awake, so how can he become immortal? What he can be, however, is a good king to his people. And that, in the end, is enough. So the poem is all about learning the limitations of human existence at a time when you feel that you'll live forever. So, by around 2150 BC, the date of the earliest cuneiform tablets relating to Gilgamesh, human beings were pondering in a sophisticated way their place in the order of existence, the meaning of life, their relationship with the gods, their responsibility to others, and so on. And there's a further use to which writing was put in Mesopotamia, the codification of law and the keeping of historical records. One of the earliest, if not the earliest, law codes was promulgated by a Babylonian king called Hammurabi around 1760 BC. It's impossible to overestimate the importance of laws for the development of human society. It means that ordinary people, the heroes of our cause, know where they stand. They're no longer subject to arbitrary punishment. Mind you, the punishments set by Hammurabi were pretty severe. For instance, if you were caught breaking into someone's house, you were to be put to death in front of the place where you broke in and then walled up inside the breach. Poetic justice. And what's also interesting is that the law code replicates a number of the laws that we find in the Hebrew Bible, in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. This suggests that the law codes were widely used throughout the Near East, albeit no doubt with local variants. As early as 9500 BC, as we saw, Mesopotamians were trading with one another. From 3000 BC onwards, however, their trading became far more intensive. It was one of the chief reasons why the region was culturally homogeneous. Exports included barley and wheat, wool, textiles, and silver. Imports included ivory, tin, copper, and gold, as well as lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Goods often traveled vast distances, changing hands many times along the way. At first, oxen, donkeys, and wild ponies, known as onagers, were used to pull sleds that dragged along the ground. Then, sometime between 3500 and 3200 BC, the wheel was invented, first made out of solid wood and later out of spokes. And around 2000 BC onwards, horses began to be used for transportation, and then camels from around 1500 BC. The Mesopotamians also shared a number of technologies in common with one another. These included copper manufacture. Copper was invented around 4000 BC and used for making axes and arrowheads, and also glass making and textile weaving. Of course, scholars can detect differences between one culture and another, but to the untrained eye, examples of metalwork and jewelry throughout the region bear a strong family resemblance. I now want to turn our attention to my final point: how people were subjected to those above them in the social order, and how the different cultures struggled with one another for supremacy. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence for the subjection of one group of people to another comes from the so-called royal cemetery at the Sumerian city of Ur and is dated 2600, 2300 BC. In the part of the cemetery that is christened the Great Death Pit by its British excavator, Sir Leonard Woolley, 6 guards and 68 women were buried. We can't be absolutely certain. It's possible that this is evidence for human sacrifice. A find from the royal cemetery, known as the Standard of Ur, also provides evidence of the subjugation of other peoples. It's called the Standard of Ur because when it was first discovered, it was thought to be part of a standard that was carried into battle. Its real purpose, however, is unknown. It's a wooden box inlaid with mosaic. One side of the box shows ordinary people queuing up to pay tribute to their king, who sits on his throne drinking with his buddies. The other side shows him at war. His prisoners have been stripped naked and are being led in file. The other side of history on the other side of the box, so to speak. So by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, we have evidence of warfare being practiced in Mesopotamia, though very likely its origins are much, much older. Sometime between 2300 and 2150 BC, the city-states of Mesopotamia became unified under the rule of the Akkadian Empire, so named for its capital, Akkad, or Agade, which has yet to be discovered. The Akkadian language now supplanted Sumerian and became the lingua franca throughout Mesopotamia. The Akkadian Empire eventually extended north into Anatolia, which is central Turkey, south into Arabia, east into Iran, and west to the Mediterranean coast. Well, the way I've phrased it makes it all sound very bland. What it means is that people throughout a vast geographical region were now being oppressed, being treated as inferior, being made to work for a master race. And now too, if not earlier, punishments meted out to captives in war would have included being blinded with a burning torch, being impaled on a stake, being flayed alive, having one's hands, nose, ears, lips, tongue, other body parts chopped off, and so on. People were certainly doing this by the beginning of the 1st millennium, as we know from inscriptions set up by the Assyrians, the imperial successors to the Akkadians, boasting of such abominable practices. Over the next 33 lectures, we're going to be looking at a number of other cultures, and it's worth noting before getting started that they all shared certain salient features in common from the perspective of an ordinary person. Number 1, you're most likely to be engaged in agriculture. Number 2, if you want to go anywhere, you'll probably have to travel by foot or on water. Number 3, you rise with the sun and tumble to bed exhausted at sunset. Number 4, you will regularly experience the deaths of those close to you, partly because of the high rate of infant mortality, perhaps as high as 25%, partly because of accidents, warfare, disease, and partly because of the much lower level of life expectancy. Number 5, in most of these societies, you'll be lucky to make it to the age of 40 if you're a man, 35 if you're a woman. 6, if you do make it to a decent age, the chances are you'll be disabled in some way, if only from failing eyesight. 7, you won't possess anything much of value. 8, you'll rarely hear of anything outside your local region. News travels slowly, if at all. The pre-modern world wasn't wired. 9, you almost certainly suffer from intestinal parasites and other chronic disorders. And finally, you're also prone to vertebral degeneration, particularly if you're a man, mainly as a result of the wear and tear of everyday life. In conclusion, the early development and prosperity of Mesopotamia were largely due to the 2 rivers that in so many ways fostered human flourishing: Now, for the first time in human history, the conditions were in place for a more continuous, more settled form of life. No longer did humans have to invent things time and again. On the contrary, something that we can justifiably identify as human culture developed over a wide area, the most spectacular demonstrations of which are agriculture, sedentism, and writing. In the next lecture, we're going to see how one river, namely the Nile, had an even more dramatic and long-lasting effect upon human flourishing.